Hello, I would like to welcome you all to A Brave New World, Meeting the Global Challenges of the 21st Century, a conference formally inaugurating the Robert S. Strauss Center for International Security and Law. My name is Jim Lindsay. I am the director of the center, and it's a very big day for us here. I want to let everybody know that the Strauss Center was made possible by a very generous gift by the distinguished UT alumnus, lawyer, and public servant, Ambassador Robert S. Strauss, and the law firm he founded, Aiken, Gump, Strauss, Hauer, and Feld. And we want to thank the ambassador. Jim Langdon, who is a partner in Aiken Gump and somebody who is and has been crucial to the Center Steinberg, is going to be joining us a little later. We're very glad to have him here. Several other people are here today who were crucial to the creation of the Strauss Center. It would take hours to detail for you everything that they have done for us. Suffice it to say that without the dedication, the commitment, and most of all, the passion of Admiral Bob Inman, Dean Jim Steinberg, Frank Gavin, the Strauss Center would not exist. So if you would join me, please, I want to say thank you very much all for that. I'm also pleased to note that John Brumley is here, and John has been a very kind friend of the Strauss Center. I want to say thank you very much, John, for coming down here. So thank you very much. I also have come to appreciate over the years that no conference ever happens unless there's some people who are willing to give up their sleep and put their personal lives on hold to make it happen. In our case, those two people are Jill Angelo and Laura Jones, and Frank Gavin and I consider ourselves blessed every day to have the opportunity to work with them, and we just want to say right now thank you very much, Laura and Jill. Laura and Jill are so dedicated to making everything work that they're not even here to get their appreciation. They are out doing their work. Now, I want to take a few moments before we introduce the panelists to talk about the reasons for the Strauss Center, because we're a new addition here to the University of Texas campus. We were created in recognition of the single fact that globalization is remaking the world as we know it. It is creating new sources of wealth and opportunity. The global economy is expanding, and once poor countries are emerging as economic powerhouses. But as we saw on September 11, 2001, globalization is also spawning new dangers and vulnerabilities. We see these problems in the daily headlines: catastrophic terrorism, nuclear proliferation, killer epidemics like SARS and avian flu, climate change, and global financial panics, to name just a few. The Strauss Center was founded to provide the imagination, the leadership, and the innovation needed to help people understand how globalization is changing the world, and to generate workable policy solutions that the public can embrace and that practitioners and policymakers can enact to meet the challenges we face. The Strauss Center proudly stands at the crossroads, so to speak, of the world of ideas and the world of action. We believe that we can accomplish our mission only by mobilizing experts across the University of Texas campus and by engaging the best minds in government, business, and the nonprofit world. The global challenges of the 21st century share a common characteristic. They are complex and multidimensional. That very complexity and multidimensionality means that finding solutions requires working with people across many disciplines and professions. The distinguished panelists who have joined us today from academia, government, and the private sector reflect the Strauss Center's bedrock commitment to bring to campus people with diverse perspectives and experiences. We intend to be a place where scholars and practitioners can meet for frank discussions on how to respond to the world's most pressing problems. We intend not to only do something exciting today, but also in the weeks and months to come. And if I may just throw in a shameless plug for an upcoming event, tomorrow at 5 p.m. over at the LBJ Library, we are sponsoring a talk by Marina Ottaway of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. We invite you all to come. I would also let everybody know that you can find out more about our events and the projects we have underway at our new website, www.robertstrausscenter.org. Let me repeat that one more time, www.robertstrausscenter.org. Now, like any new organization, we have much to learn and to do. One thing we already know, however, is that the Strauss Center is blessed to be at a university with such a breadth and depth of talent. There is a lot you can teach us, and we welcome your ideas and thoughts on people to bring in, projects to pursue, and events to hold. Now, we recognize that the Strauss Center has a very ambitious agenda ahead of it, but I can assure you that we plan to do our part to live up to the UT motto, what starts here changes the world. I'm going to stop now and change my hats and go from welcoming you to the conference to introducing you to our panelists. And before I do that, there's a little bit of housekeeping I have to do, which is to say that anyone who has an officially approved electronic device, cell phone, BlackBerry, or anything else that's likely to spontaneously erupt into a playing of the William Tell Overture or the latest hit by Stoop Doggy Dog, if you could mute it or turn it off, we would greatly appreciate it. Now, I am really honored to have the opportunity to introduce today's panelists. They have impeccable credentials across a variety of areas to come and talk to us today about our topic of how globalization is changing the world. And I'm going to do it in alphabetical order. So I'm going to begin with our panelist in the center, Heidi Cruz. She is a graduate of Claremont McKenna College. She has an MBA from Harvard Business School. You're going to see a theme emerge in a little while on this score. She has an MBA from Harvard and a Master of European Business from the Free University of Brussels, which I believe is in Belgium. Test my geography knowledge. After working, am I right? Good, very good. After working as an investment banker, she joined the first administration of President George W. Bush. She served in a variety of posts. She was Special Policy Assistant to Ambassador Robert Zoellick, the U.S. Trade Representative. She was Director of the Latin America Office at the United States Treasury, and she was a Senior Advisor to the Undersecretary of the Treasury. Heidi subsequently became Economic Director on the Western Hemisphere on the staff of the National Security Council under Dr. Condoleezza Rice, where she was responsible for liaising with Latin American presidents, finance ministers, ambassadors, and central bank presidents on a variety of issues dealing with the economy and their interaction with multilateral institutions. Heidi, thank you very much for joining us today. It is probably appropriate that I leave off introducing Heidi by talking about multilateral institutions, because our next panelist, the Honorable Kristen Silverberg, is Assistant Secretary of State for International Organization Affairs. She is a graduate of Harvard University and the University of Texas Law School. She was a law clerk to Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas, worked in private practice, joined the Bush administration, held an impressive array of posts. You were first Special Assistant to the President in the Office of the Chief of Staff. In 2003, Kristen left and went to Baghdad to serve as an advisor to L. Paul Bremer on putting up an elected Iraqi government. Kristen returned to Washington, where she served in two key White House posts. First as Deputy Assistant to the President for Domestic Policy, and then as Deputy Assistant to the President and Advisor to the Chief of Staff. In August 2005, she was sworn in as a Assistant Secretary in the Bureau of International Organization Affairs. And for people who aren't familiar with the setup of the State Department, the Bureau IO, as it's called in the lingo, handles U.S. policy toward more than 80 different international institutions, most notably the United Nations and its specialized agencies like the World Health Organization and the Food and Agricultural Organization. And I should also point out that Kristen has been recognized by the University of Texas as one of its outstanding young Texas X's. So congratulations on that. Our third panelist is well known to many of you. It's Dean Jim Steinberg, Dean of the LBJ School of Public Affairs. Jim is a graduate of Harvard College, Yale Law School. He clerked at the U.S. Court of Appeals for the D.C. Circuit, worked on Capitol Hill, also served several places, think tanks, notably at RAND and at the prestigious International Institute for Strategic Studies. In 1994-1996, he was at the State Department as Director of the Office of Policy Planning. In 1996 until 2000, he was Deputy National Security Advisor to President Bill Clinton. There are a number of people in Washington at a place called Brookings who are very thankful that upon ending that part of his government career, he came to Brookings, where he was Vice President Director of the Foreign Policy Studies Program. Jim has written numerous books and articles and book chapters on foreign policy and national security topics, most recently co-authoring Protecting the Homeland 2006-2007. I want you to join me, I'd ask you all to join with me in thanking our panelists for coming here today. If I can get up. Now, our conference is entitled A Brave New World, Meeting the Challenges of the 21st Century. And this particular panel is called From International to Global, How Globalization is Transforming Our World. This title comes from a talk I heard Dean Steinberg give, so if you don't mind, I'm going to throw the first question over to the Dean. You know, as you have gone and talked about the evolution of the LBJ School and the whole startup of a new master's program, you've been very emphatic that it's going to be a master's in global policy studies, not the more traditional name, the Masters of International Affairs, and you've rather eloquently talked about the reasons for that. So I was hoping maybe you could share with the audience here how it is that you see globalization remaking the world and why it's crucial to focus on the word global rather than international.
Thanks, Jim, and thanks to everybody here, particularly you and Frank and Jill, for all the work you've done in making this a reality, and all the other people in the room, Admiral Lyndon, Mr. Brumley, and others who've played such a critical role in making this a reality. It's really exciting for me to be part of this. And I have to say, as you were doing the introductions, Jim, it did strike me that there's a new motto, which is what starts at Harvard ends at UT. I also was struck when you said, well, the panel represents academia, the private sector, and the public sector, and I was thinking, where's the academic? And then I realized that was supposed to be me, which still a slightly unaccustomed role, but I am very happy to be here. And I think that the choice of panelists really reflects in part the answer to the question that you've asked. If you think about the work that Kristen was doing, that Heidi has been doing, the way in which we think about the world and the way the United States has to interact with the kinds of challenges that it has is profoundly transformed from the good old days of national security agendas, geopolitics, and the like. It's often tempting when people say, what has globalization changed? The answer is everything. There's almost nothing that touches our lives, and particularly that touches the policy world, that isn't affected by this profound change in the international landscape, a change that's driven by the tremendous global interconnections of our economy, the remarkable transformations that technology, and particularly information technology, have brought the world closer together, have shrunk distances, eliminated boundaries, and really made every issue an issue which is global in nature. There's that famous old saying from the 60s, which is to think globally and act locally. Everything local is global now. I teach a course here, and I start the course asking my students to try to think of a topic that doesn't have a global dimension. And it's almost impossible to come out with it. You think about the traditional challenges like healthcare or education or jobs, they're all global. Everything that we do, it takes place in an international environment. And what that means is not just that there are a lot of different countries involved. I mean, that really is the difference. We're talking about phenomena which countries are a part of, but there are a lot of forces and actors which transcend that traditional notion of international as being involved with states. States now, rather than being the essential and only building blocks of the system, are now just one part of a very complex set of actors and forces that change the world. And you said it well in your introduction. It is a set of changes that have opened enormous opportunities. And I'm sure Heidi will talk about some of the great economic opportunities, but also in bringing the world closer together to increase diversity, to make the possibility for people everywhere to be exposed to new ideas and new opportunities. Globalization is as much sushi and kung fu movies and Pokemon as it is the kinds of things that we think about global financial and capital flows and things like that. It is an opportunity for diversity to grow, if handled right, people to be exposed to the best ideas, and which is very supportive of the kinds of values in our open society that we try to promote. But it obviously does bring with great dangers. The ability to use borders as a way to protect ourselves is increasingly less successful. And what that means is that we face a new set of challenges of trying to take advantage of the benefits that globalization offers on the economic, political, social, and cultural fronts and minimize these very serious risks, and they are enormously serious. I mean, the kinds of dangers that we face from terrorism, from crime, from drug trafficking, from environmental problems, from transnational health issues are as serious as anything we've ever faced in our history. And as powerful as we are, we have less capacity acting as a nation to do that. And it's less powerful as a nation, one, because some of these forces are simply beyond what governments can do. And some are things where even if governments can do things, they can only be effective if they act together. And I'm confident that Kristen will say a little bit about what it means to act together in this world and how imaginative and innovative we have to think about building these kinds of structures of cooperation, which include but aren't limited to governments and are not limited to formal organizations, but other ways of cooperating, again, to get the benefits of these enormous positive changes while protecting ourselves against the risks.
Terrific, Jim. I'm going to take you up on your offer to ask Heidi a question. I realize that globalization is more than economic. It's Pokemon, it is Kung Fu movies, it is Daisuke Matsuzaka getting ready to pitch in Game 2 of the American League Division Series. But economic change is a big part of it. And we talk a lot about how the global economy is changing. And I think in a little while we'll get to some of the consequences of that. But Heidi, I'm hoping you can sort of help me sort of understand what's actually happening. Because when I was preparing for today's panel, I went to the World Almanac, picked it up, and I read some fascinating facts. The volume of global trade has increased 28-fold over the last 4 decades. The amount of money in foreign exchange markets over the past 4 decades has gone from $15 billion a day to $2 trillion a day. Those are really big numbers. But I was hoping maybe, given your experience, the various places you've worked, if you could sort of give us a handle on what's really happening in the global economy.
Sure. It's a great question. And as I was thinking about the panel, I realized that given my current work, the place where I'd probably be able to speak is not so much on international organizations, but more on what do we see in the business sector and how has it changed the way that we work. And I would make a couple points in response to that. I think there is certainly a macroeconomic dimension to it that involves countries. And that translates into market opportunities for investors. And I think the probably best example of that is China. But when we look at where there used to be pools of capital and kind of how markets used to work, the big money centers, if you will, were New York and London. And as we look globally today, New York and London are no longer the only sources of capital. Governments around the world are big sources of capital. And interestingly, we used to sort of differentiate in the capital markets between U.S. as being sort of a safe haven to invest, and then the emerging markets being riskier locations, and people structured portfolios and all accordingly. And what we've seen is a lot of the emerging market countries have actually become such big actors in our trade markets.
Can I just ask a question? Who do you define as emerging markets? Just so for people out there have a sense of.
Sure. I mean, the countries that I'm thinking of are places like certainly a lot of countries in Latin America, even Brazil. So I'm thinking kind of what have been termed, broadly speaking, as the BRIC countries. Brazil, Russia, India, China are some of the largest. And then in the region where I spent some years, all of Latin America really being an emerging market, and much of Asia as well. And then you also can factor in sort of the Eastern European countries having also come into that fold. And some of the larger countries have actually become such large participants in the goods and services trade markets that they've built up a strong bevy of capital reserves at their federal reserves, their central banks. And they've now realized that capital is mobile, and because there's so much information now given the internet, they have direct access to all the deals that we're seeing in New York and London and the U.S. And countries are actually putting big pieces of capital to work through these government funds to increase the return on investment. Prior to that, it was obviously mostly in fixed income type products. So, you know, the most recent example of that I'm sure everyone's read about that was extremely interesting on Wall Street was the Blackstone deal, and China's kind of government fund interest in purchasing a piece of arguably one of our largest and most interesting IPOs this year. So then you have this kind of situation where you have companies that were private equity firms taking companies from being public to private, taking itself public, and being funded by China. And that's something that, you know, even in, you know, kind of 1990, 1994, those first years when I first kind of came out of college and graduate school and all, and started working on Wall Street, we just didn't see that. So I think, kind of in summary, new pools of capital that are really changing the way that deals get done.
And capital wants to go where it can get the best return.
And it now has the freedom to move.
Okay. Greater fluidity, I suppose.
Greater fluidity, and I think, you know, we now have greater capital convertibility as well. There used to be a number of countries that their currencies were not convertible. And that's still the case. We still have pockets of that, but they find a way to convert it when there's a good yield.
Very good. Kristen, let's sort of shift gears. I also want to draw out something that Jim said to the latter part of his remarks about building structures of cooperation. You run a very important bureau at the State Department, and I think I mentioned in the opening more than 80 different international agencies or organizations or institutions and programs, how we want to label them. It might sort of help sort of as a start, or just for you to sort of explain what it is the Bureau does and what that sea of institutions looks like. Because when most people think of international institutions, they just think of the United Nations, and that's the end of the conversation. And as you know well, it's a very long list.
Yeah. Well, first, let me say thank you for having me here. I grew up here in Austin, and as Jim mentioned, I spent 3 really valuable years at the University of Texas School of Law, so I'm very proud that Austin is home to this important forum for discussion and debate, and you should be congratulated. We work in the State Department in my bureau with about 82 different international organizations, but administration-wide with about 250. And these are organizations, you know, there's no generally accepted definition of an IO, but the one we usually use is a multilateral institution, so one with at least 3 members, made up of governments, so something where governments, although sometimes private actors are represented, that's formed based on some kind of formal agreement between states. That definition encompasses everything from the United Nations and its specialized agencies to some very small and very discrete international organizations you've never heard of. Someone in my bureau focuses on an organization that deals with zoological issues. I don't even know what that means. But it's very important to someone in the United States, and so we in the State Department engage actively with our experts through that organization. We work with organizations like the World Food Program, which helps to feed about 100 million people a year all over Africa and Asia and Latin America. We work with the Food and Agricultural Organization, which deals with things like food safety issues. organizations like the International Civil Aviation Organization, which helps to negotiate airline safety. So these are the kinds of organizations that deal sometimes with very specific standard-setting issues, sometimes with much broader political issues like the kinds of things you read about regarding the United Nations Security Council. When I was thinking about this topic and the way that IOs relate to globalization, I guess one point that came to mind is that our international institutions really have been agents of globalization. They facilitated the kind of interconnectedness we see economically and politically and culturally. There are obviously lots and lots of different causes of globalization, including technological development, the lowering of trade barriers, those kinds of things. But part of what has driven that is the ability of international organizations to facilitate cross-border transactions. Just a couple examples. The Universal Postal Union, which was founded, is one of the oldest IOs, and it was founded after the invention of the telegraph. And that's what enables you to easily send a letter from Austin, Texas to Burkina Faso if you want to. The International Telecommunications Union, which is the thing that standardizes the way cell phones work, and which lets you pick up the phone and call someone in Tripoli and talk on a cell phone. The International Civil Aviation Organization, as I said, which is the thing that gives travelers assurance that when they get on an airline in Doha, they at least know something about the safety record of that airline. So these are the kinds of things that have made interconnectedness easier and maybe move more quickly.
Well, let me pick up on that theme, and I want to go back to something that Jim Steinberg said. Maybe I can press him a bit. Kristen, you just sort of talked about how international institutions facilitate globalization, among other things, by common standards, allowing people to sort of interconnect smoothly. Jim, as you know, there's sort of a segment in the academic world that would say, wait a second with all of this globalization stuff, Pokemon's nice, Dice K's nice, let's take a deep breath, that before World War I, we also had globalization. We had all these kind of interconnections. So there's two lessons here. One is it ain't all that new, and it's not necessarily or inherently sustainable. How would you react to that?
Well, it isn't completely new, and it's certainly the case that if we 1910, we'd be talking about the remarkable changes in the world and the growth of global trade and all these wonderful technologies like the telegraph and the steamship and the like, depending on the year we pick, the airplane, that had transformed the world, and it will never be the same again. But I basically share in broad terms Tom Friedman's assessment about this, which is that this is globalization 3.0, and that each one represents a significant qualitative change from the one that was before, and by far and away the most important part. And the difference is digitization and information technology, because it really has, in very, very important respects, ended space and distance as an important element. I mean, there is the others shrunk it in the sense that it reduced times and reduced distances. But now there's a common reality. It isn't just it is now at the speed of electrons that things happen, which is essentially simultaneous in every place. If you think about this, Heidi's talking about global markets. Markets don't open and close anymore because there's no reason to them. They're always open because the information is always available. Trade, which was limited to kind of things you could hold and make, is now trade in ideas and services and intellectual property, which does not need any borders to it. And the infrastructure of that change is denationalized. So if you think about the debate about surveillance that's taking place now in the United States and what are the right rules, there's no nationality. We used to have rules that talked about U.S. persons and things that happen in the United States. In the digital world, it's a total accident as to where those packets go. And there's no particular reason for them to have a nationality or identity. And so I think that this is qualitatively different. Is it irreversible? It doesn't mean it won't have setbacks. It probably will. And I spent a lot of time talking to my students about this. I can give you 20 good and plausible scenarios that would have a major impact and set back globalization dramatically, the most important of which, in my judgment, would be either a massive pandemic health problem or a massive weapons of mass destruction terrorist attack in which borders would close, economies would be set back, we would become much more autarkic for a time. I also say, look, globalization 1.0 had some big setbacks. Think about the Dark Ages compared to the Roman Empire. This could last for even hundreds of years, depending on the consequences. But over time, I think these forces are unbottleable again. And so I think that the kind of transformations that we're talking about, if in the straight line will continue. The straight line never happens, so there will be perturbations, maybe big ones. But I think that the broad factors we're talking about are ultimately here to stay.
Well, let's talk a little bit about those broad factors being sustainable. And I note that Heidi pointed about this these large pools of capital that want to go places where they can seek a return. And I'll accept that that's the reality. Let me just ask you sort of the normative question. Is that good, that we have all of this capital sort of sloshing around? Does it create new perils for us? I'm a subscriber, though not a dedicated reader of the Wall Street Journal, and all I know is that over the last year they kept telling me that the housing market's in a bubble, it's going to burst, nothing happened. Then all of a sudden somebody coughed or something and markets went crazy. Then I heard, oh my God, it was going to spread and the global economy was going to die. Next thing I know, somebody in Washington gave a press conference and it was all over, and now markets are going back up. So help me understand what it means to be in this global market with all this capital, because I would sort of say, as an average person sort of walking down the street, wow, it seems to be working out quite well. Am I justified to be happy, or am I like the guy who jumped off the Empire State Building just past the 15th floor saying, so far so good?
Right. It's a great question, and it's been key, certainly not just for this summer, sort of what some are calling a real financial crisis that we've been through. But I think people have been asking this question for the last 10 years, really since the Asia financial crisis, when it was sort of brought to everyone's attention that there is quite a bit of contagion still left in the world. And how far does that spread? And I think to kind of start with a conclusion, I think net, it's a really good thing. And why is it good? I think this year is a perfect example. We're in a situation this year where we'll probably have below trend U.S. GDP growth. And in our past, the U.S. has been it's been a strong market, it's been a safe place to invest. And so people have, and it's been an economy of consumption. 70% of our GDP is consumption. A very small part of it is savings, many years negative. And then there's investment and government spending. But we have really been a driving force globally for a long time because of our consumption. We are now facing a point where the U.S. is really slowing down, and what is going to buoy growth this year and keep product and service markets very healthy, and companies in the U.S. with strong earnings growth, meaning a strong stock market, which we've seen a relatively strong stock market so far this year, even given the summer, is global growth. There's a lot of consumption demand coming from some of these countries, Brazil, Russia, India, China, that previously were somewhat of a drag on economic growth. So I think net, it's a real positive. One of the dangers, to kind of address the fact that there are real dangers and some setbacks, and I think this is a point that will stay with us permanently, is increased correlations. And that's what we saw this summer. And there is danger in that. The reason...
That's when good things happen here, good things happen there, but also bad things happen here, bad things happen there.
Right. I mean, right. It's a positive one or a negative one relationship or anything in between, but it shows that they are related in some ratio. So, the danger there is when we had some bit of a subprime meltdown in the U.S., and this was really kind of triggered by reduction in housing prices. And then it very quickly became clear that it wasn't just that housing prices were declining in California, but that actually banks on Wall Street and in Brussels and in Frankfurt had invested in these very complex structures where the actual product was an apartment in, Costa Mesa, California. And so we saw a bank almost go bankrupt in England that had to be bailed out because of this. And a bank in Germany did falter. So, those kinds of things, I think, even by the capital markets, were not anticipated that it would have such an impact on European growth. And I think the interesting corollary to that is, unlike the Asian crisis, every economic setback has different lessons to be learned. The risk here in investors' minds was not emerging markets. It wasn't the countries that have political risk. The risk was in the U.S., and it spread dramatically.
And I believe some German shareholders were very, very unhappy with what happened to their bank because of Americans borrowing too much money. But
yeah, that's right. There's a bit of an anti-American sentiment abroad.
Yes. What you raised, Heidi, is interesting. It sort of poses a question for Kristen, which is, when bad things happen on the international scene, there's often an expectation that there's an international institution that can step in and handle it. That's true sort of on the security front, but also on the economic front. Maybe it's the IMF or the World Bank. If you think of sort of concerns about infectious disease, there's the hope that the WHO will step in. You ably pointed out how a number of international institutions that aren't household names have helped midwife globalization. Are international institutions ready for the big bump in the road in globalizations? Are they adapting?
Well, I still think I think it's clear there's a very important role for international organizations in dealing with some of these cross-border challenges. And everything that Heidi pointed out on the economic side, there's an analog on the non-economic side, the kinds of contagion you see, quick cross-border transmission of avian influenza, or the kinds of things we see in terms of drug cartels operating across borders. Those are kinds of things where international organizations have a particular role to play because they can fill the space between states and operate in places where states have failed. There are a number of them that do really essential work in those areas. WHO and FAO are some examples, the UN Office on Drugs and Crime. But I think that there's a fundamental test coming for international organizations regarding how they respond to globalization, and that's how will they react to the threat that terrorist groups use the threat or the threat of globalization and take advantage of the opportunities presented by failed states to recruit and facilitate violent acts. How international organizations deal with that fundamental problem is really a test, because what we see these days, and maybe the realization at the State Department post 9/11, is that the dangers the United States government is facing now are not primarily presented by strong states. They're primarily presented by weak states, by places where non-state actors can take advantage of weak governance to set up terrorist operations. And that's dealing with that challenge, the dangers of failed states, is something that international organizations are not always well designed to address for several reasons. One is that in the international system, there's still the strong view for many states that you don't interfere in the domestic matters of a state, and this is what we're seeing all over the news from the Chinese and Indians on Burma. So there's still a sense that there's still a debate about the line between what's properly within international affairs and what's really a domestic matter. And the second is that in many of these international institutions, the world's worst actors have disproportionate influence. They have far more influence at the United Nations than they do in the global economy, for example. And so there's an ability for some states, not well-motivated states, to block the kind of action that we'd want to see, and we see that in Sudan. That's the role of some of people in carrying Khartoum's water for them and keeping this peacekeeping mission out. So I guess I'd say there's still a very important role to play, and there are some organizations, especially the less political ones, that are playing a critical role, but there's a big test coming for international organizations.
Let me be unfair and push you a little bit more on this, because you put your finger on, I think, one of the really tough challenges, which is, and Jim talked about in globalization, we need to build lasting structures of cooperation. To be fair to Jim, he was quite clear that it isn't just having international institutions of state to state. But to some extent, you have to have international institutions where partner states come together. And you've quite ably pointed out that in some circumstances we have a problem in that the values we hold and how we want to act are not held by other countries, so they're not going to want to cooperate. But we nonetheless feel that those issues are very important. How do we sort of square that circle? Because a lot of people would say, well, if they don't want to work with us, the heck with them, we'll go off and do it our own way, which I think has its own sort of. How do we sort of think through that puzzle?
Yeah, well, first, I certainly agree with Jim that the role of non-state actors it's a much more important role in our diplomacy today. I think a lot about, my bureau, the job I'm filling now, was first created in the aftermath of World War II for a man named Dean Rusk, who legendary diplomat, who went on to be Secretary of State, and there's been a lot written about that time. And the understanding of international organizations at the time was that they would serve as a forum for states to get together, and the idea was that if we all sit in the room together and talk, then the major powers won't go to war. And we realize, as I was saying, now that that's not the fundamental challenge. There really is very little risk of major power conflict. There's a lot of risk from non-state actors. So I certainly agree with that, and with the importance of focusing on that. But that's not to say that states don't matter. They do fundamentally. In places where there are strong states, non-state actors play essential roles, but there's no substitute for a state. There's nothing that can fill that gap in terms of security, of protection of fundamental human liberties. So the way we think about the challenge in the State Department these days is how do we turn all of our international institutions, our own diplomacy, international organizations, the efforts of others, to helping to strengthen governance, to strengthen states, and create the kind of mechanisms that can fill these ungoverned spaces. I think I think there's room for a lot for the international organizations to do a lot in this area. But there are some fundamental challenge, and particularly fundamental challenges when you're dealing with universal organizations like the UN that, as I said, are frequently dominated by bad actors.
Fair enough. I said it was an unfair question, so I want to reiterate that. I'm glad you didn't ask me the question in return. So, Jim, I want to go back. I want to take one more run at you on globalization and sustainability, because as I was listening to Heidi talk, and again, I keep thinking of these pools of capital, all of a sudden I see myself stuck in an auto dealership and I'm forced to watch Lou Dobbs. And he's railing on this. And what I also note from watching Arbitron ratings is that his ratings have gone up since he's talked about the dangers of globalization. It's undermining the American economy. This is not a blessing for the United States. Is globalization sort of compatible with our political system, or do we run into a big hiccup there, both because of fears on the economic front, but also because of fears that it's creating new geopolitical challengers, most notably China?
Well, I mean, it's complicated, and the classic problem that there are winners and losers, that it's easy from an economic theory perspective to talk about, Pareto superior moves and all that good stuff and how greater wealth is created. But the fact is that without interventions to deal with the pain that the losers feel and find ways to spread the gains so that there isn't a separate pool of winners and losers, the people who will be highly motivated and tend to be the losers. It was big, remembered in the Clinton administration, that one of the great insightful moments was when then Secretary of Treasury Larry Summers said to President Clinton, Mr. President, when you're talking about globalization, talk about consumers. Remind people they're consumers. And this is an important dimension because we are enormous beneficiaries of this, and people, they think of themselves in their parts of their life like their jobs and the like, which are very affected, and less in the other dimensions. And the nature of politics obviously tends to aggregate those issues of pain. They tend to often be geographically concentrated, although the outsourcing and offshoring of services and the digitization has now made that a more complex economic picture. But I think it is true that it's easier to mobilize around the harms, but we've had this a lot. I mean, I remind everyone, that for all the Sturm und Drang about China now, it sounds very much like what we talked about Japan in the mid and late 80s, when we were bashing, Japanese TV sets on the steps of the Capitol and the like. And the good news is that although there are concerns at the margin, that there is actually a fairly sustainable support if not for going forward more dramatically and sort of rethinking this, to not really turning back the clock. For all the talk, we're not going to repeal NAFTA. We're not going to pull out of the WTO. And so I think that there is a recognition that we have to look at these things. I think the key is to deal with these equity and distribution issues. I mean, I think the challenge now for domestic American policy is to decouple all the consequences of the Schumpeterian destruction that comes with globalization from everything that you have. So that's why we talk about portability of health insurance. That's why we talk about wage insurance and issues like that, which absolutely have to be part of this. So in terms of political sustainability, we just have to change the agenda. If everything turned on your job, then it's understandable why people would see this as hugely damaging. But if you had wage insurance, if you had good retraining programs, if people understood that their livelihood, their economic and personal security was not going to be threatened, there might be a broader sense of understanding that this is a broader game.
I want to sort of pick up on that, and if I get you to jump in here, Heidi, because Jim sort of talked about how economists tend to drain the emotion, the lifeblood out of issues when they talk about it. The old notion is when somebody else loses their job, it's a dislocation cost. When you lose your job, it's a catastrophe. And I'm struck, because again, I pick up, I'm an occasional reader of the Wall Street Journal, and I pick it up, and it just seems like lots of bad news. I went to school in the great state of Michigan, which seems to be coming apart at the seams, and there, if you read the Detroit Free Press or the Detroit News, the news is all bleak because sales at Ford are down 26%, they're down 18% at GM, and this big sort of flattened world of Tom Friedman, they're getting their lunch eaten. Mm-hmm. And quite honestly, since I've recently bought a new car and I drove some of their products, I can see why they're getting their lunch eaten. So, which creates political stresses, and my sense is sort of the political bargain Jim talks about works if people feel on net that they're actually going to benefit from it. So what I really want to ask you is not to tell me why GM and Ford are struggling. I think that's pretty obvious. But what sectors of the American economy are doing well? Are there companies out there that are doing well, that are thriving in this global environment, that are sort of can be emulated in a sense? I mean, what are the good news stories as opposed to the doom and gloom stories?
Mm-hmm. Sure. I'll start a little bit broader and then can kind of talk, sector specific or companies. But I think I couldn't agree more with your comments. And I think it is somewhat of a broad economic question that you always run into, everything from theory to practice, which is there are long-term and short-term consequences in finance and in economics. And I think the long-term consequences are quite good. The short-term ones can have some rough paths along the road. The thing that I think is important for all of us to sort of drive home as we are in all of our worlds, whether it be government, private sector, and academics, is what incentives are in place with globalization, and is that a good thing for companies, for families, for individuals, for communities. And that, I think, is the greatest selling point of globalization, is the incentives. When I look at them, you can ask yourself, what is globalization? And around the world, the longer-term result of it is a higher standard of living. And why is that? It really requires that people become educated. And if that means a sector shift with job relocation programs or education training programs, we talked about that extensively and had extensive programs for that when I was working with Bob Zellick on trade issues. And it's a critical issue. And I think, unfortunately, the proponents of globalization don't focus enough there. And the antagonists sort of focus only on the negatives, and there's kind of a disconnect in between, and it's our responsibility to match those. But it requires people to be educated, for one. It requires companies to compete. And that has the result of lowering prices. We have inflation in the U.S. right now of, on a core level, this is sort of excluding energy and food prices, which are quite volatile, of about 1.8%. That is phenomenal. Many in this room remember, decades ago when that was unheard of. That is largely due to globalization. And what kind of companies? Companies like Walmart. And in the news today, there were articles about Walmart, front page of the Journal, being squeezed because it even is facing increased competition for its pricing policies. When we look at sort of what companies will likely, do well in spite of slow U.S. growth. That really gets to, I think, the core of your question. There are a lot of retailers. You take companies like a Walmart who will still do well. Target, some of the higher end retailers may get hit a little bit because they tend to be more luxury goods than pure staple spending. But a lot of consumer staples are global. You take something like Crest toothpaste. You can buy that anywhere in the world now. People will continue to spend money for that. I venture that Starbucks will probably continue to do well.
Let me ask,
black coffee.
Okay. Let me ask a question. I don't mean to be facetious about this, but should I be worried that you didn't list anything that we build? No manufacturing, no something I can touch and...
Yeah, I don't know a lot about that sector, so I'd want to go actually look into it and see if those companies are doing well. I think home builders are not doing well sort of this year broadly, but commercial builders globally are doing quite well. And so you kind of have to dissect. And you mentioned the car companies. Some of the car companies like GM actually has had a lot of labor issues, obviously, in the last couple of weeks. But their stock price has done well once they resolve some of those issues, and I think they're doing a lot of things to compete better. And so, when we look at our stock market, there's, thousands of companies that are part of that index, and that index continues to rise because those companies' earnings are rising, and they're rising because there's demand abroad.
Okay. Kristen, I want to ask you actually a variant of the question for Heidi, which is, we talk about needing international institutions. They've helped midwife this, but there is a political carrying capacity. In a lot of parts of the United States, people don't like international institutions. They see them as sinister. And you've pointed out quite eloquently some reasons why you could be skeptical of some institutions. So my question is, and I think as Jim pointed out, with things like NAFTA, there's a whole clientele that makes their living off of beating up on that, and we can list a whole bunch of other organizations. You're the public face of the State Department on some of these issues. What are the arguments you make to people to convince them that these things aren't all bad, that there are actually benefits for the United States and Americans in them?
Yeah, well, I should say I don't unapologetically defend every international organization or U.S. participation in it. In fact, I've been, one of the advocates in the U.S. government for not participating in international organizations when it requires, in my view, too fundamental a compromise of U.S. values. So the Human Rights Council in Geneva is one in particular that I've argued we should not participate in because it spends most of its time bashing, if I can use that word, Israel, and very little of its time helping people living under oppressive governments. But these are matters of a very serious debate. What I try to point to are the kinds of organizations that are doing really important on-the-ground operational work or the kind of work that can give rise to progress in alleviating poverty or fighting disease. So the kinds of organizations that focus on what they do rather than on what they say. These are ultimately political bodies, and they, for the ones that are larger, closer to universal, there will always be things coming out of them that don't reflect U.S. policy, but they still can be very important partners to us for all the reasons I talked about. One important point related to what Heidi was saying about some of the political problems with globalization we see in many other countries related partly to economics and a lot to cultural issues. Because if you're in the U.S., globalization means being connected with people in other parts of the world. But if you're in a developing part of the world, globalization means being run over by American culture. And so we see an effort to use international organizations to try to put the brakes on globalizations at some points. A cultural diversity convention to try to protect indigenous cultures from foreign influences, this kind of thing. And so we deal with the domestic politics of globalization and IOs, even from other governments.
Jim, can I, just livening things up, talk a little bit, because I think, Kristen's right to raise issues like the Human Rights Council, but I think it is an important challenge as we think about globalization and the United States' role in it. I mean, there's no question that the Council is a joke, and it's badly constituted, but the question is, can we afford to say, well, at some point, we just don't like how other people decided, and we're going to stand out? Because I think that precisely because it doesn't do anything, one has to wonder whether, even if we have to stand up and be the only vote, that we shouldn't be there to talk about these things. And I think there's a risk, because of the nature of the international system, that if we only participate where we decide that the institution meets what we think are minimum standards, that others are going to see this as a kind of a selective participation. And I think the big challenge for the United States is one of trying to understand how do we work in a world in which we are enormously influential, by far more influential than anybody else. And that has great opportunities, but it also leads others to react against us. And how we show a certain amount of humility in this context to be part of it. Again, I don't think we should pretend or somehow mute our voice in these kinds of institutions, because it is a tragedy after the whole discussion about reforming the old Human Rights Commission that we ended up with something that is as appalling as what they came up with. But I do think that to some extent we give our opponents an easy shot by not being part of it. And so I understand the arguments that Kristen and others have made, but I think part of what we need to do is convince others that we understand that people do have different views about globalization. We went through this whole debate in UNESCO many, many years ago, and we pulled out. We didn't like it. And it was the same kind of thing. It was horrible. I mean, it really was. There probably aren't too many people here who remember just what a ridiculous kind of classic non-aligned movement platform it was for. But did we really do ourselves any good by coming out of it? I mean, it's one question about whether you're going to sort of fund projects, which I think is there. You can say, should the American taxpayers have to fund something that other people think is worthwhile? And that was part of the problem with UNESCO. But I think where it's a question of sort of trying to understand that we don't just take our marbles and go home when we don't like the result. Is it going to be important for our leadership going forward?
You want to?
Yeah. Yes, and I think that's exactly the debate, and they're all very legitimate points. I always think of UNESCO as an example for how the U.S. can focus its attentions in a way that makes sure our engagement in international organizations is designed to be as productive as possible. We spend about $70 million a year at UNESCO, and so there's a real cost. Our decision whether to participate or not participate has a fundamental cost for our ability to engage in effectively in other international organizations. I was part of the decision to go back into UNESCO at the beginning of this president's administration, and that was reasonably controversial at the time because we'd had such a bad experience in the past. But what we found is that by staying out for a period, we were able to use our commitment to join as a way to leverage some changes at the organization. And I was thinking we had some Israel problems at UNESCO too, and just this last week I went in New York with the Director General to an event at the Simon Wiesenthal Center where we on anti-Semitism, and it was a very public demonstration from him that he intends for Israel to get a fair shot at UNESCO. Anyway, I see the point. I do think we have to think U.S. participation inevitably lends credibility and legitimacy to bodies, and we have to think about how we use that very carefully. And we have to think there are costs in every case. There are costs to where we decide to commit our attentions, and we really ought to think of this not really from our perspective, but from the perspective of somebody living under the government of Burma or somebody living in Darfur, and what would be most helpful to them.
Okay, you've thrown a lot of really good ideas out on the table. What I'd like to do now is to bring the audience into this. If you would have a question for our panelists, we have a mic here. If you could come over and use it, that would be great. Otherwise, I'll keep asking questions. And if you could identify yourself, that would be great.
My name is Joey Shaw, and I'm an LBJ student, also Middle East Studies here. I have a question for Ms. Silverberg, and it's a bit more specific. Given the successful ascendancy of things like the Islamic Development Bank and other kind of calls from the Muslim world for greater cooperation on the international scale between Muslim countries, such as we probably heard recently for a free trade agreement between Muslim countries, I'm wondering if you see a future, or what future do you see for greater cooperation between Muslim countries on an international organizational scale?
Do you mean, sorry, within the Islamic world, or between the U.S. and the Islamic world?
I mean within the Islamic world, also with USW.
I think I see, that other panelists may have a different perspective, but within international organizations, I actually see a lot of cooperation with the OIC countries, and in fact, they operate as a pretty powerful bloc. And I attribute most of the problems we're having at the Human Rights Council exactly to that. They vote cohesively on every single issue, and our bloc, we and the Europeans and the Canadians, don't. And so actually, I see them working very effectively as a unit. We've thought a lot in the State Department about how we can better engage with the OIC, because this is going to be it's critical that we do it, partly because we have to send the right signal to the Islamic world about our willingness to engage with them, and partly because, as a practical matter, we're going to have to if we're not going to get our we're not going to get run over constantly by OIC coordination.
Jim, I want to come back to something you opened up with, and I'm sorry, do you want to ask a question?
Oh, go ahead.
No, I insist. I'm trying to be a polite host.
My name is Andrew Rauch. I'm an undergraduate here at UT. I study government. And I want to thank everybody for being here, and thank everybody who made the Strauss Center possible. It's a great thing to have at the university. Okay, thanks. Okay, and also, I'm also a part of the Central Texas Model UN conference we do here at UT, so I can't tell you how proud I am to see an Austinite and a Longhorn in the Bureau of International Organizations. I just sort of wanted to ask, I guess traditional international relations theory kind of focuses on the role of states as the primary actors and as unitary actors in kind of an anarchic system. And of course, traditional realists or liberals try to work with that, or the role that international organizations can bring to bear on state behavior. And I think globalization, depending on how you define it, has sort of thrown that into a dilemma, and you kind of have to look at it in new ways, depending on how you define globalization, I guess. But mostly we heard from Mr. Steinberg about the rise of non-state actors and the power they can bring to bear. And of course, states have to reconcile that. At the same time, international organizations have to reconcile that. And Ms. Silverberg spoke about a kind of coming challenge for international organizations in terms of this globalization's rise of non-state actors. And I was wondering how you feel international organizations can reconcile with that. Sorry, that's a really long question.
Yeah. Sorry, and you might want to hop in some more on this. Generally, the posture we take is to welcome the involvement of NGOs and other constructive non-state actors in debates in international organizations, because especially in parts of the world where we're dealing with weaker or less responsible states, it's critical that we have their perspective. Just as an example, in the Human Rights Council, we're about to undertake this periodic review where every country in the world is going to have their human rights record investigated, and we've made it a point of principle that NGOs, the information that NGOs bring to the table, has to be a big part of that discussion. So generally we have this, this general posture. But as I was saying earlier, that isn't to say that we don't think states matter anymore. They do fundamentally matter, and a lot of the buzzword we use in the State Department these days is transformational diplomacy, which is how do we commit all of our attentions to help strengthening the institutions of governance, because it still seems to us that the fundamental danger we face is this problem about ungoverned spaces. Ungoverned spaces in Africa, in the border between Afghanistan and Pakistan. These are the places where we're really trying to focus our attention, and that really can be done with a lot of sort of development of the institutions of civil society, but fundamentally it requires a government in place that can enforce security and the rule of law and all of these things.
I mean, it is a complicated question. One of the first, my own first experience with international organizations is I participated in 1985 in a meeting of the NPT review. And I was an advisor to an NGO. And the NGOs played an incredibly important role in the NPT review conferences because, one, they had a lot of expertise, and very few of the delegations, other than a few very important countries like the United States, had similar kinds of expertise. So, one, they brought a lot of knowledge to the table. Two, they brought the ability to basically legitimate some of the decisions to a set of actors who might not take the actions of governments per se as legitimating, in part because, you know, some people don't like the governments, in part because some of the governments themselves are questionably legitimate, right? And we have a lot of governments that are non-democratic. And so having NGOs as part of it and seeing the process as fair and comprehensive and views being considered tends to make the thing politically more acceptable. And then, although it's not entirely true in the NPT conference, but certainly in some of the other ones that Kristen was talking about, they're actually the actors who are out there doing things in a lot of these places. And so they become an important agent of the ability, even if the states have made some decisions, that they become important, particularly on the humanitarian side. They're indispensable. There's just no way that governments are going to do, or even IOs as IOs are going to do all this stuff. So over time, I think people have come to sort of see that this is, one, you couldn't keep them out. You just, it'd be hard to explain it. But two, it's actually done right. It can be important. It's interesting, you know, who's in favor and who's against. The United States has actually historically been pretty good about NGOs being in. Get other countries, very sovereigntist countries like Mexico, who are totally opposed to it. I mean, their view is the international system is based on states. That every time there's a meeting of an international organization that people want NGOs to be there, they're at the parapet saying, no, 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 it's illegitimate, even though it's, you know, seen in other respects as having very progressive policies. So it's not, it's still a debate in the international system about, you know, how, I mean, what are their legitimacy? They're self-appointed groups, they've defined their own agenda. Who are they to have a voice? And, you know, how do you decide? They don't have votes, they don't get to have their membership vote on what they're going to do. So we have a very mixed system now, but I think over time, as a practical matter, we've seen that there are a lot of advantages to their being part of it.
Can I just ask a factual question on that? Who decides which non-governmental organizations get to be part of this? Because when you think of American domestic politics, you have a grassroots movement, and if it injures somebody's important interest, they go out and create their own advocacy group. It's sometimes referred to as astroturf lobbying or what have you. I mean, if you were to list some NGOs, I'd know who the virtuous ones are, and I'd say, oh yes, by all means invite them. But what prevents sort of non-virtuous NGOs forming whose purpose it is just to block what it is you want the international organization to do?
It depends entirely on the accreditation rules of the particular international organization. Our general posture is when an NGO, an American NGO wants, or any NGO wants to be accredited to a UN body like ECOSOC, which deals with economic social issues, our general view is unless there's some really compelling reason not to. We voted against some NGOs that had pro-pedophilia bylaws, that kind of thing.
It wasn't what I had specifically in mind, but it's in a ballpark.
This doesn't come up regularly, thankfully, okay. But with the exception of something like that, we generally have a very open accreditation policy. But there are lots of countries that use accreditation politically. So, for example, if there's any NGO that comes up with the name Taiwan anywhere in the title, you can guarantee there will be a Chinese injection. Yeah.
Okay, fair enough. Do we have any other questions from the audience?
I'm Trampus Crow with the Center for Politics and Governance at the LBJ School. We've talked a lot today about economic globalization, and that's certainly important. And as a government, it seems like we spend a lot of time and energy on economic globalization. And we touched a little bit on cultural globalization. Considering that certainly in our relations between the West and the United States and the Middle East, cultural globalization is where there's the most tension, where our culture is very prevalent to certain underrepresented groups like women or perhaps Turkmen Kurds. It's very appealing, but it's not at all appealing to those in power globally. Do we spend enough time trying to manage and influence cultural globalization? And if not, what's the best way to do that? Is it through State Department and government organizations, or is it through IOs and NGOs?
Can I ask an addendum to that? Can you manage cultural globalization? I'm not having much success in my household, which is why I
was going to add, as the panelist most unqualified to address that question, should we be managing cultural globalization?
You want to take a crack?
I mean, first of all, I think it's important to remember there are two sides to this question. I mean, globalization has made Al Jazeera possible, as well as, you know, Coca-Cola and all of that other stuff. And to some extent, I would argue that we, you know, I know the surveys are not too positive about the state of American education, but there's more opportunity for us to be aware of other cultures. as opposed to the past, where it really was much more one way, in which a lot of American culture was being exported, but it was much harder for the others to get there because kind of culture followed the economic stuff, and so we had this sort of Coca-Colaization, McDonald'sization. But I actually think that it is more of a two-way street than people tend to give credit for, and that people complain about the part where the other guy's culture lands in and crushes you out, and the French, worry about their movies and things like that. But in fact, you certainly see, it's quite remarkable in Asia in particular, the pluralization of culture. And it's had a huge impact, by the way, because, although there are still important political conflicts and historical ones between Japan and Korea and Japan and China and stuff like that, that actually the young people, they know each other's culture, they see the movies, they watch the soap operas. There is a lot more sort of appreciation of the kind of the non-government and political side. So first I would say that it's important to get a more balanced picture of it and not to see this as just American culture going out and crushing everybody else's. But second, I think that there's a separate question between what sensitivity government should show with trying to manage the sort of the question about should we then try to interfere with this? I think first of all, it is almost impossible to do. I cut my teeth a little bit on a very understandable preoccupation in France with not having pro-Nazi memorabilia, programming, content broadcast. And of course, since TV doesn't matter anymore, but the internet does, they tried to stop it being sold on Yahoo. Well, it's hard. Because it is everywhere, and it's you have one nation saying, well, this is a piece of culture that we don't like, but others have different rules and different laws. So I think there are some downsides, there's no doubt, but I think that while governments need to show sensitivity in their own stuff, I think it would be hard to think about strategies that actually try to reach into the rest of this and try to get a policy on it.
Do you want to jump in, Kristen? Okay, well, I think we have come to the close of our time. Please join me in thanking the panelists for an excellent and stimulating set of remarks.